The night my grandparents met the unknown. There are some stories that burrow into your mind and refuse to leave. Stories so bizarre, so inexplicable, that they make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. My father told me this story countless times, never once breaking his straight-faced demeanor. I always assumed it was just a family myth, until I asked my grandmother. Without hesitation, she confirmed every detail, saying she remembers it as if it happened yesterday. It was the early 1960s. My grandparents lived deep in the secluded woods of Michigan, miles away from the nearest town. That night, my grandfather had just returned home after dropping their 3 children, one of whom would become my father, off with relatives. The house was dark, wrapped in an eerie silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. But my grandparents, unfazed, settled in for what was supposed to be a peaceful night, until the lights came. Bright, blinding flashes pierced through the tiny window in their bedroom, illuminating the darkness with an unnatural glow. Jolted awake, they stumbled into the kitchen, instinctively drawn to the back door. My grandfather, ever the protector, motioned for my grandmother to stay behind as he cautiously reached for the door handle. The moment he opened it, the night exploded into color. Before them, suspended just above the ground, was a craft unlike anything they had ever seen. It hovered effortlessly between the trees, its football-like shape warped and unfamiliar, its metallic surface nearly obscured by the pulsating, otherworldly hues radiating from within. The colors weren't just shining, they were alive, shifting in ways that defied logic. Then it appeared. A figure stepped forward, emerging from the craft's glowing platform. It walked, on 2 legs, like a human. But that's where the resemblance faded. It was eerily hairless, its elongated head and bulging eyes giving it an almost fragile, deformed appearance. It was watching them, studying them, and then it raised its hand. Not in a wave, not in a greeting, just held it there, frozen in midair, as if waiting for something. My grandfather stood paralyzed, his mind unable to process what was happening. But before he could react, my grandmother stepped outside, standing beside him. And in that moment, seeing her face, seeing her fear, her disbelief, my grandfather realized that this was no dream. A second being emerged. Unlike the first, this one carried something, a gift. It was a flat, round substance, larger than any pancake they'd ever seen. It looked soft, pliable, almost like bread but different. The first figure reached out, offering it to my grandfather. He hesitated, reaching forward, but the being suddenly withdrew, then turned to my grandmother instead. She exchanged a glance with my grandfather, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. But something in her told her to take it, so she did. The creature then produced another of the strange grain-like pancakes and took a bite, as if to reassure them. It watched, waiting. Slowly, cautiously, my grandparents tore off a piece and ate it. The taste, unlike anything on Earth. The texture was soft but dense, the flavor foreign yet familiar. It wasn't unpleasant, just different. Satisfied, the beings gave a final, motionless wave, then retreated into their craft. The platform retracted, the flashing colors began to fade, and within seconds, the ship vanished into the sky. For years, I pressed my grandparents about the pancake. Did they keep it? Did they give it to the government? Did they report it? They shook their heads. Back then, who would have believed them? I never thought I was abducted, but my friend, he was convinced. I was 15. Every night, my best friend Jay and I would sneak out around midnight, wander the empty streets, and make it back home by 4 or 5 a.m. Just in time to avoid our parents catching on. It was routine. But that night was different. At around 1 a.m., we climbed onto the trampoline in my backyard, lying flat on our backs, staring up at the sky, talking about nothing and everything. The stars were bright, endless. But then, something changed. If you're inside right now, look around. See how the ceiling meets the walls? How the corners are sharp and well-defined? That's exactly what happened to the sky. 1 second, it was vast and natural. The next, it was boxed in, like someone had folded reality itself into a giant cube. Then, from the southeast corner of the sky, it appeared. A massive, absolutely colossal UFO, bigger than anything I've ever seen, easily covering a quarter of the sky. It didn't roar, it didn't hum, it didn't make a single sound, it just spun. But not like a frisbee, this was different. The sides turned while the whole thing hovered smoothly forward, completely silent. Jay and I didn't speak, didn't breathe. We didn't even need to. Somehow we both knew, stay still, stay flat, don't move. At the exact same moment, we flipped onto our stomachs, pressing ourselves against the trampoline, instinct taking over. No whispers, no gestures, just a deep, unshakable feeling that if we moved, if we acknowledged it, it would acknowledge us. We watched in stunned horror as it changed direction, moving in a strange, deliberate S-curve across the sky. Time stretched, each second feeling impossibly slow, yet the whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. Or so we thought. Because the second it disappeared, boom, daylight. Not a slow sunrise, not the creeping glow of dawn, just instant, blinding daylight. One moment it was 1:15 a.m., the next it was 7:30. We lost 6 hours in the blink of an eye. We didn't talk about it. We didn't need to. We just locked eyes, bolted for home, and never mentioned it again. Weeks passed, maybe months. Then one night, I was talking to my brother's girlfriend who was deep into paranormal stuff. I told her the story, half laughing, expecting her to brush it off. Instead, she went pale. "The time loss," she said. "You blacked out for 6 hours, that's classic abduction." I laughed it off. "Guess I should try hypnotherapy, huh?" She didn't laugh, didn't even blink, just stared at me, dead serious. "Don't. People who were abducted, the ones who remember, they wish they didn't." The night I'll never forget. I was camping with some friends in North Georgia when the rain came down in sheets, soaking everything. Rather than tough it out, everyone abandoned their tents in the woods and decided to rent one of the on-site cabins. They were in for a long night of talking and drinking, but I was exhausted from kayaking all day, so I decided to crash in my car instead. At some point in the night, I woke up. The rain had stopped, the air was cold, and I realized I'd left my sleeping bag in my tent. The cabin was warm and glowing with soft light, but everyone inside was fast asleep. It was 3 a.m. I didn't want to wake anyone, so I grabbed my tiny pen light and made the trek alone. To get to my tent, I had to pass by everyone else's. Mine was the last one, sitting at least 50 feet from the others, just me in the woods behind it. I crawled inside, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and tried to catch a few more hours of sleep before sunrise. That's when I heard it. Light whispers, right outside my tent. I froze. The voices weren't speaking English. In fact, I couldn't make out any words at all. It wasn't like any language I'd ever heard, just hushed, indecipherable murmurs. Then, out of nowhere, 2 glowing orbs appeared outside the tent door. They weren't flashlights. They didn't cast beams or have that familiar yellowish glow. They were colorful, but not like any color I could describe. Almost like a shifting mix of hues that didn't belong in this world. As soon as the lights appeared, the whispers turned into an argument, urgent, breathy, intense. The voices grew louder, but still whispered like they were trying to keep their conversation a secret. The lights moved, first to the side of my tent, then to the back, then in front, circling, swirling, faster. And that's when I realized I hadn't heard a single footstep. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. I knelt on the tent floor, muscles tense, waiting for the zipper to come undone, my brain flipping through escape plans like a horror movie playing in real time. Do I fight? Do I run? The voices grew frantic. The lights spun faster. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. And then, silence. The lights vanished like someone had flipped a switch. The whispers stopped, and all that was left was the dead, empty quiet of the woods. I stayed completely still, didn't move, didn't even breathe too hard. There was no way in hell I was stepping outside until the sun came up. I've never told this story in full before, but the scariest part? Years later, I went to a horror movie premiere, Beacon Point. There was a scene in that film with the exact same voices I heard that night. The second they came on, goosebumps ran up my arms. I don't know what I encountered out there, but I know one thing for sure. It was real, and I never want to experience it again. The tall one, I don't know if this was a real encounter or just a dream, but if it was a dream, it was the most vivid, lucid, and terrifying one I've ever had. In my dreams, I usually feel like an observer, like I'm being led by something beyond my control. But this was different. I was fully aware. I could feel, smell, and think clearly, just like I do when I'm awake. It started when I was about 11 or 12 years old, sometime around 2009 or 2010. I was staying with my great-grandparents in a rural part of northwest Georgia, near a small lake. Their house sat at the end of a road, surrounded by only a few scattered homes. It was quiet, peaceful, until that night. It was around 1 a.m. when I got up to get a glass of water. The house was dark except for the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the large windows in the living room. As I stepped into the hallway, something immediately felt wrong. The air felt thick, like time itself had slowed down, and the moonlight, it wasn't right. It looked unnatural, distorted somehow. Then I noticed the living room lights. They were on, but not in the usual way. The glow was yellowish, just a little off, like reality was slightly warped. I stepped further in, and then I saw them. In the center of the living room stood a tall figure, draped in an ominous black cloak. To his left and right were two smaller beings, but every time I tried to focus on them, they seemed to flicker, like static on a television screen. Their outlines blurred, shifting, almost scribbled in my vision. But the tall one, he was clear. He was real. At first, he didn't seem to notice me, but the second I focused on the smaller figures, they vanished, and that's when he turned around. The moment he faced me, reality itself seemed to bend. The wrongness I had felt before surged through me tenfold. I realized something horrifying. From behind, his cloak only reached the height of a very tall man. But when he turned, he grew taller, like his head had been invisible before. And then I saw his face. It was pale. Not just pale, unnaturally white, with no blemishes, no imperfections. His head was elongated, smooth and eerily human-like, yet completely alien. His mouth was small, barely noticeable, and his nose was nothing more than two faint slits. But his eyes, they were the most horrifying part. They were huge, almond-shaped and black. Not the black of emptiness, but something deeper. They looked like they didn't belong in this world, like they were breaking some law of existence. They weren't just eyes. They were something else, something impossible. I tried to move. I couldn't. I tried to scream. Nothing came out. A suffocating wave of pure dread crushed me. Not the fear of death, but something worse, the fear of complete annihilation. I'm not religious, but at that moment, I felt like I had a soul, and he was about to steal it. He leaned forward. His long, thin fingers emerged from beneath the cloak, reaching for me. His mouth, it stretched too wide, opening unnaturally as if to consume me whole. His hand moved closer, closer until his fingers touched my face. Then, blackness. I woke up the next morning, but not in my bed. I was lying on the living room couch in an awkward position, like I had been dropped there. It was around 6 or 7 a.m., early morning light filtering through the windows. I sat up, dazed, my heart pounding. Had it really happened? I stumbled back to my bedroom, climbed into bed, and buried myself under the covers. The moment I shut my eyes, the memory hit me all at once. Terror washed over me, deeper than anything I had ever felt before. I didn't leave my room until I heard my great-grandmother cooking breakfast. The second encounter. 2 years passed. My great-grandfather had passed away, and my family had moved in to help my great-grandmother. The nightmares never really stopped, but then it happened again. This time I woke up around 2 or 3 a.m., thirsty. I stepped into the hallway and immediately froze. The air was thick again. He was here. I tried to turn around to go back to my room, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, not physically, but mentally. It was like an invisible force had taken hold of my mind, leading me toward the living room. The strangest part, I felt calm, as if I had accepted what was coming. When I stepped into the living room, he was already waiting for me. This time, he was alone. The smaller figures weren't there. He didn't smell like death like before, but I heard a faint humming noise coming from outside. It wasn't a car. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. He studied me for a moment, tilting his head slightly. Then he smiled, a small, almost human smile. And then, just like before, his hand reached out. Darkness. I woke up on the couch again. This time the fear was different. It wasn't just terror, it was curiosity. The dreams over the years, he kept appearing in my dreams, sometimes once every few months, sometimes 3 nights in a row. Every time, the dreams felt more real than real life. Then one night I decided to stay awake. I sat in the living room of my new house, waiting, watching. I knew he would come, but he didn't. Instead, I blacked out and woke up in the weirdest position imaginable. I was upside down against the couch, my legs in the air, my back bent over the edge. Blankets were strewn around me like someone had dropped me there. I never saw him that night, but I know he was there. The promise, I don't know what he wants. I don't know why me, but the last time I saw him in my dreams, he told me something. We will meet again. And I believe him. It was 1997, a bitterly cold February or early March night in New Hampshire. 3 of my friends and I were driving down a winding road toward my house at around 10 p.m. I sat in the back seat, bundled up against the chill, when suddenly my friend behind the wheel tensed up. "What the?" he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. The guy in the passenger seat gasped. "Oh my God! Oh my God!" Those of us in the back craned our necks, struggling to see what had them so spooked. And then, right in front of us, a bright light appeared, expanding, dilating like a pupil, before shrinking again. The car slowed to a crawl as we stared in astonishment. Above us, 4 or 5 other lights pulsed in and out of existence, each growing as bright as a police searchlight before fading into the darkness. It sounds crazy, I know, but we were all there. We all saw it. We pulled into a shared driveway on a hill that overlooked a frozen reservoir, solid enough to support a truck for anyone about to claim swamp gas, and stepped out into the freezing night air. Our breath fogged as we looked up, hoping for another glimpse. We got more than we bargained for. High above us, large, elongated lights, shaped almost like lenses, hung in the air, slowly drifting in different directions. At least a dozen of them loomed overhead, shifting and pulsating in eerie silence. Then came the real mindbender. From the sides of these massive lights, smaller ones, bright as stars, began emerging. 4 or 6 at a time, they darted back and forth with impossible speed, changing direction instantly. They moved erratically, almost playfully, zigzagging and spiraling through the sky before retreating back into the larger lights. It was a mesmerizing dance, a display that defied everything we thought we knew about movement and physics. For an hour, we stood there in the bitter cold, too stunned to leave. Finally, we couldn't take it anymore. My friends dropped me off at the bottom of my long, icy driveway, one I never wanted them to drive up anyway. My dad was an alcoholic, and we lived off the grid, something I was embarrassed about. As their car disappeared down the road, I glanced up one last time. Nothing. Just the silhouettes of trees swaying in the wind. Then a sudden, overwhelming panic hit me. A deep, primal fear. My heart pounded, and without thinking, I sprinted up the driveway, barely noticing the ice beneath my feet. I slipped into my room, locking the door behind me. I don't remember sleeping that night. For the next few days, my friends and I were in a daze, still processing what we had seen. But strangely, we didn't really talk about it outside our small circle. At least I didn't. And as time passed, we stopped bringing it up altogether. Years later, maybe 7 or 8, I reconnected with 2 of them. I hesitated, then finally asked, "Do you remember that night? The lights?" I braced myself, half expecting them to dismiss it, to say it was a dream, a hallucination. But they remembered. Every detail. And we all felt the same way, embarrassed to talk about it, unsure of what we had witnessed, yet absolutely certain that we had. I was about 8 or 9 when my mom told me we were going on a day trip to visit her high school friend. Excited, I grabbed my Game Boy Advance, knowing her friend had kids my age. I was ready to show them up in a racing game I'd been practicing. While at their house, I overheard my mom and her friend talking in hushed voices. "You should go play in the other room," they told me. "We need to talk about adult things." Curious, I lingered just out of sight, half expecting to hear some juicy new curse words. Instead, I heard something much stranger. Her friend had a 4-year-old daughter who had started sleepwalking soon after they moved into their new house in Northern California. The area was suburban, but not overly developed. Lots of empty homes and patches of forest between communities. One night, they found their daughter sitting outside in the backyard, completely unaware of how she got there. Terrified, they started locking her bedroom door at night and even barred her windows to keep her from wandering off into the woods. Then, one night, everything changed. A thunderous boom shook the house, jolting them awake. It felt like something had slammed into the side of the house. They checked on their sons. Both were still asleep, undisturbed. But when they unlocked their daughter's room, she was gone. Panic set in. Then a knock at the front door. They opened it to find their 4-year-old daughter standing there in the freezing night air. "Where have you been?" they asked, their voices trembling. She simply pointed down the street. "With the men." Her father's blood ran cold. He stepped onto the porch and saw 2 figures in long coats walking away under the streetlights. Fury overtook fear, and he took off sprinting toward them, shouting for them to stop. They didn't react, not even a flinch. The figures turned a corner, disappearing from sight. When the father reached the corner, they were gone. No sign of them. The locks on the doors and windows? Untouched. No sign of forced entry. The police were called, but there wasn't much they could do beyond keeping an eye out. And the little girl? She was fine. Not scared at all, just sleepy. She yawned and went right back to bed. To this day, I wonder what really happened that night.